Well, this morning as we come in, we celebrate this first Sunday in Advent as we draw closer and closer to the celebration of Christmas and of the birth of Christ and just all that that means in the midst of our lives. We're going to begin a new series on Sunday morning, and so for the next number of weeks, we're going to be looking at a series titled, All I Want for Christmas. And I'm sure that's a question that perhaps you have been asked. That's a question that maybe you ask kids in your life. You know, what is it that you want for Christmas? If you could have only one thing, what would that be? And so we're going to kind of go back into the Christmas story and begin to see some of the different people that were involved in that very first Christmas. And maybe start to ask the question, well, what can we learn from them as well? One thing I do know is that one's attitude or approach to Christmas often changes with age. As you get older, it seems as if Christmas just comes so quickly. There's always something else to get ready for, another gift to buy, the house to get ready, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, it's December 1st tomorrow, and I got to get moving. And so one of the things I had to do, thank goodness for warm weather, was to put Christmas lights up around the house, right? I thought, I am sunk when it snowed 2 weeks ago. I thought, well, I guess we're not having Christmas lights this year, folks, because I am not getting up on that roof. But Christmas comes so quickly. But when you're a child, it doesn't seem as if it can come soon enough. I mean, you all know as kids that Christmas is coming, but there's always that question of how many more days, how many more sleeps, is it Christmas yet? There's this great sense of excitement, this great sense of just anticipation of wanting and waiting. And sometimes, because of this great desire for Christmas to come, we do things that maybe we shouldn't do, but we do it anyways. And so we're going to do a real quick survey here to see just, if you're in the same camp as me, and also if you're honest people this morning. But how many of you, at one point in your life, knew that there were Christmas presents in the house for you, and they weren't yet under the tree, so you went looking for them? All right? How many of you, once you found the gift and saw that it was already wrapped, unwrap the gift to see if it's what you wanted? A few more? Okay, last one. How many of you, upon seeing the toy that was wrapped nicely for you, took the toy out of its original packaging and played with it? No. Hey, if you're not going to answer honestly, neither am I. Final question. How many of you still go hunting for gifts in your house? Yeah, some things you just never grow out of, right? There's that sense of excitement, there's that sense of anticipation. And so one of the things this season we're in is this season of Advent. And it's this building, this sense of waiting, this sense of anticipation. And so it's always interesting. I'm always fascinated with how different holiday seasonal traditions began. And so I'm sure you're all familiar with an Advent calendar, right? Well, I was wondering, when did that start and how exactly did it start? So I did what most people do. You Google it, right? Because Google's never wrong, I'm pretty sure. And so what the computer told me was the idea that Advent calendars actually began in about the 1800s in Germany. And it was started by Christians who were counting down the days until Christmas by either putting a piece of chalk above their door or by lighting a candle. And so there was this sense of build-up as they got closer. And so I wondered, well, how exactly did the Advent calendar begin? Didn't really answer my question because we love Advent calendars, right? There's all the days leading up to Christmas, and you open up the door, and there's a gift, or there's a little piece of chocolate, or there's a picture, or there's a Bible verse, or something along the lines. And this is what I think happened. I think that there was a German mother who got so tired of answering the questions, how many more sleeps until Christmas? Voila! Advent calendar, people. Check the calendar, open the doors, don't ask me the question anymore. But I think it's built in, rightfully so, this sense of waiting, this sense of expectation, this sense of wondering, is the day finally going to come? Because if you go all the way back to the very first Christmas, there was a greater sense of an expectation and anticipation. You see, so often we read our Bibles and we can flip easily from the Old Testament into the New Testament. We can flip from the last book in the Old Testament, Malachi, into the first book, Matthew, and it's a turn of the page. But that is over 400 years of history. Over 400 years of God's people waiting to hear from God again. Waiting with a sense of expectation. Perhaps a wonder. Is this Messiah? Is this promised child going to enter into our world? And so as we begin to think just about that sense of wonder and waiting, we're going to jump back into the story of Christmas. We're going to go to Luke's gospel, and we're going to be introduced to this first couple of Christmas, Zechariah and Elizabeth.
The scripture this morning is taken from Luke 1, verse 5 to 25, and it's on page 56 of the New Testament portion of the Bible. The word of the Lord. The birth of John the Baptist foretold. In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time came for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years." The angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months remained in seclusion. "The Lord has done this for me," she said. "In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." May the Lord bless to us his reading of his word.
And so there we're introduced to Zechariah and Elizabeth. And sometimes you may wonder, why in Luke, telling of the birth of Jesus, why would he not just get right to it? Why would he not just cut to the chase and talk about Mary and talk about Joseph? Like, why are we told about so much detail about Elizabeth and Zechariah? And I've said this numerous times, but I think it's worth repeating. One of the things that always fascinates me are the details that we are given in Scripture. We're actually told the conversation that Zechariah has with the angel Gabriel. And it always causes me pause to stop and say, why are we told that? Why are we reminded of this exact back and forth between Zechariah and Gabriel? And what I love about Zechariah and Elizabeth is I think they are the perfect couple to set the stage for Christmas. They're the perfect couple to just remind us of the reality again of what Christmas represents. Because there's so much that we can learn from Zechariah. Real, practical, day-to-day realities. The first one might be more just for the guys here, so women, feel free to tune me out at this point right here. But it's amazing to see the conversation that Zechariah has with Gabriel. Gabriel shows up. The angel of the Lord appears. And his first response is the typical first response when an angel shows up. It's terrified. It happened to Mary, it happened to Joseph, it happened to the shepherds, it happens to Gabriel. And so when we talk about having seen an angel, if you want to know if you've seen an angel, the first question should probably be, was I terrified? Was I like quaking in my boots, right? Because that's so often the reality. But then this conversation goes on and Gabriel says, your prayer has been heard. Your wife Mary, or your wife Elizabeth, is going to be with child. Can you imagine just the wave of emotion that must have been flowing through Zechariah? This hope, this desire that he had been praying for over and over and over again was now being granted. And what was his first response? Really? Are you sure? And this is where the little bit of gold comes out for all of us who are married. Zechariah says, I'm old. I'm an old man. And we're not told it in Scripture, but then he goes on and says, and my wife, pregnant pause. He's probably thinking, all right, what am I going to say about my wife? Because I'm talking to an angel of the Lord. This is likely going to get back to her. She's not old. She's well along in years. Truth and grace wrapped up in the perfect package. Thank you, Zechariah. Right? Because so often we find ourselves and we're like, oh, I wish I hadn't have said that. And so a little side note, like a little bonus material here this morning. Read the Bible not only because it helps your relationship with God, it'll help your relationship with your spouse as well. So Zechariah is just a perfect example. But we see so much more even happening here. Because what we see is the situation of Zechariah and Elizabeth waiting upon God. We're told very early on of the families that they came from. Both of them came from the family line of priests, which in modern day language is essentially they were preachers' kids. They were kids who kind of grew up around the temple. They grew up around other priests. They understood the rules. They understood the commandments. They understood the promises. Ever since Zechariah was running around just as a little guy, he would have been understanding just the traditions and the realities of life with God. We're then told later on in verse 6 that both Zechariah were living right with God, that they were blameless in the sight of God. They had followed all of the commandments. They had followed all of the regulations. And that is the best way to say they were in a relationship with God. And yet, as you begin to read further and as you begin to understand the history that they're finding themselves in, all was not well for them. As a community, the nation of Israel was literally crumbling. There had been these great promises that had been given thousands of years earlier to people like Abraham when God says, I'm going to make you into a great nation and I will bless you so that you will be a blessing. And this small remnant of Israel is probably sitting there yet again conquered, this time by the Romans, dwindling in numbers, nobody taking them seriously any longer, and wondering, not only are we not blessing others, we are being ridiculed, we are being mocked by others. And so God, where are you? Why are you allowing this to happen to your people? But it wasn't only a community struggle. We're also told in verse 7 that this was a personal struggle as well, as Elizabeth and Zechariah were unable to have any children. I could only imagine what they must have been doing for year upon year upon year, praying, asking, desiring that God would bless them with a child, and yet nothing. Couldn't imagine just the emotional pain that would go along with that. But in addition to the emotion, there was also the spiritual questioning, because it was understood and believed in that day that if you were without child, that obviously it must have been something that you have done. And so imagine you're Zechariah, you're Elizabeth, you're the one who leaves the party. You're the one who leaves the store. You're the one who walks down the street and you hear the comments. You feel the reality, this weight bearing down. And it seems as if God had not yet shown up. How do you remain faithful? How do you continue to put your trust in God in the midst of life? In the midst of those moments of life when it seems unfair as to what is happening to you. I love the way that the story begins with Zechariah and Elizabeth, because it comes right at a place in history where the questions would have been, is God active? Does God listen? Does God actually care what is going on in my life? Would have been questions and doubts and uncertainty. You see, life can so often be challenging. Regardless of whether you choose to follow Jesus or not, we find ourselves in difficult situations, difficult seasons in life. And the question so often is, how do we respond? How do we remain faithful? How do we continue to trust in God in spite of the circumstances and the situations that we find in life? What's interesting is when you look at verse 6 and 7. Verse 6 describes the reality of Zechariah and Elizabeth as having lived good lives, of having been faithful to God. And then verse 7, we're told the reality of them unable to have a child. And so often we can look at these verses, we can interpret these verses one of two ways. We can interpret this as saying, well, wait a second, God. This doesn't seem fair. This doesn't seem right. They're living faithful lives, yet difficult things are happening to them. And suddenly faith becomes situational. Faith becomes circumstantial. We think that if we live a certain way, if we remain faithful to God, then we shouldn't have problems or difficulties or hardships or obstacles. And anyone who's lived life understands that's not the reality. And so maybe we need to interpret not only Zechariah and Elizabeth's situation differently, but we need to interpret our own lives as well differently. That maybe the reason that they were able to deal with the hardships and the brokenness and just the emotional toil that they were experiencing in verse 7 to be without child is because of the relationship with God. You see, the history of Israel at this place in history was a difficult one. We hear this word remnant, which means it was a small portion of people. People were walking away. People were throwing their hands up and saying, God, I haven't seen you active. I haven't seen the reality of you in my life, so I am moving on. Yet there was this remnant like Zechariah and Elizabeth who remained faithful in spite of their circumstances. One of the most difficult things I believe in life is waiting. Waiting for something greater to occur. We see it at Christmas with little children, of just waiting for the day. It becomes excruciating. It becomes painful. They don't understand 3 more weeks. They understand today, and today isn't Christmas, so why is that not happening? Blow it out onto a larger spectrum, and so often we find ourselves in difficult circumstances, and we know in our minds that God has a plan and God has a purpose, but in our hearts we're thinking it's not happening today. And we have to deal with today. And that's why I love the Christmas story. Not just because we get to Bethlehem on Christmas Day, but because of everything else that leads up to it. This sense of waiting, this sense of trusting, this sense of believing that even though we don't know when, God, I'm going to continue to side with you. It tells us that it's natural to struggle with these questions and these issues in life. I think it's natural to have moments of worry, of wondering, God, is this ever going to happen? I think it's natural to have moments of doubt, of saying, I'm not sure if this is going to happen. But the final step is that moment of resentment where we say, it hasn't happened. I cannot believe you allowed this to happen. And so the question is how do we stop worry and doubt leading to resentment and walking away? I believe Zechariah has an answer for us. And it's seen in the day-by-day living with God. I'm pretty convinced that anyone who drives a vehicle falls into one or 2 categories. You're either someone who starts to get nervous when the fuel gauge dips below a quarter of a tank, or someone who likes to push the limits. I love how everyone starts looking at each other. It's almost like perfectly divided within a family. Not going to mention any names, but I'm a person who once it goes below a quarter of a tank, I start to get a little nervous. I start to think, okay, where's the next gas station? I really should refuel. Some people remain nameless, call me a wet hen. Not very nice, I don't think. But it's probably the right description. And so there's those people who fill up at a quarter of a tank, and then there's those people who not only let it go down to empty, and I love what they do with cars now. It started out with the indicator, right? You put the indicator light one on. Now they have cars that will tell you how many more kilometers you can drive, right, until you run out of gas. And I know people who the kilometers are going down and are like, I know this car better than you know this car. I can push the limits. And they probably take pride in running it all the way down. How many of you know somebody like that? Yeah, exactly. All right, fantastic. I think one of the great lessons that we learn from Zechariah is that Jesus doesn't want our tank to run on empty. And I'm not talking about your car tank. A little bit of side note, if you are one of those people who run your tank down on empty, don't do these 2 things. Don't call me because you're getting no sympathy from me at all. And don't blame God for being stranded on the side of the road. He gave technology to people. You need to follow the technology. But I think what Jesus wants is that we don't allow the tank of our soul to hit empty. Because we all know that when we buy a car, when you run a car, you have to fill it up with fuel. And that the fuel is that which is able to enable the car to continue to run and run and run. Not for a week, not for a month, not for a year, longer and longer and longer. But you got to be faithful in refilling the tank. It's not like you can fill the tank once and then you run out of gas and you're at the side of the road and you call up your dealer and like, hey, whoa, you sold me a lemon. What is the deal? This car isn't running. It was running perfectly, and now it's not running. It's not a head scratcher. It's so often I wonder if we do that in our own relationship with God. You see, one of the subtle lessons that we learn from Zechariah and Elizabeth when it says they lived life with God day by day, moment by moment, and that is what enabled them to remain faithful in the difficult times. You see, the angel Gabriel said to Zechariah that this son of yours will be born at its appropriate, proper time. It means God had it marked on his calendar. You know, we're not always aware of the exact timing of God. But will we come to that place of trusting in him in the midst of the difficult moments in life? And I believe that only becomes possible when we are day by day choosing to follow and to live with him. Jesus says at one point, it's important to have childlike faith. And I was thinking about that this week. I was thinking about how do children deal with this period of waiting, with this period of wondering. One day at a time. One sleep at a time. When Jesus was teaching us not to worry so much about what's going to happen tomorrow, he really gave us the theology of one day at a time. Don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about the next day. Focus on me. Trust in me. One of the great reminders of Christmas is that in these seasons of doubt, in these seasons of uncertainty, faith is never misplaced when we put it in the hands of God. One of the great realities of Zechariah and Elizabeth is how joy becomes the fuel of our relationship when we live every day, not based on the circumstances. That's happiness. Joy goes beyond that in knowing that God is with us. God is with us. And so at this season of Christmas, perhaps you are in a season in your life where there's a sense of wonder. There's a sense of uncertainty. I hope you can be encouraged that as we celebrate at the Lord's table, a table of joy, we know that God is at work. Your faith is not misplaced as we celebrate the reality and the goodness of God in the midst of every day. And so perhaps this week, in the busyness of this season, in the excitement of what is yet to come, we can use Christmas as an opportunity to refuel again in the goodness of God so that we will be prepared for whatever the new year may bring. But we can be certain of this: God is with us. Please stand as we sing together.